Privyet. The title of my paper is Only Where There Are Tombs Are There Resurrections. Nietzsche's Posthuman of Invincible Life. A reading of the prophet from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche tells us that the fundamental conception of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the idea of the eternal recurrence. The chapter in which the idea of the eternal recurrence is first introduced is titled On Redemption. The immediately preceding chapter is the prologue to it, and it is titled The Prophet, der Wahrsager, literally the soothsayer or the truth-teller. The prophet foretells that on the path we are on, the future will be little more than a long nihilistic twilight in which humankind declines in an ongoing renunciation of life. As Zarathustra himself had warned earlier, there will come a time of the last human, the end of human evolution, and that means that this decline can reach a point of irreversibility. As against the prophet's foretelling, Zarathustra has come to teach us how to master renunciation by willing the eternal recurrence of the past, setting humankind on an upward path to the evolution of the overhuman. Many questions arise at once. How did we come to be beings of renunciation? What is the mortal harm in being so, such that it will lead to a time of the last or final human if unchecked? And although it is clear that willing the recurrence of the renounced past is an act of renunciation, of affirmation, why is our becoming beings of affirmation a step forward in our evolution to the overperson? Finally, Zarathustra puts himself forth as the one who alone can teach us how not to be beings of renunciation. He identifies himself as the teacher of the eternal recurrence. But what put Zarathustra and Nietzsche in the position to recognize that by renouncing we are not progressing? Must he not himself have progressed individually ahead of us to be in the position to diagnose the lack of progress that the rest of us have? So who then is Nietzsche? Nietzsche answered the question of who he is in his autobiography, Ecce Homo. On my reading, Nietzsche's purpose in Ecce Homo was to interpret a bad inheritance from his father. In and by itself, the bad inheritance, the lack of life force, as he says, was just a factual matter, but as Nietzsche interprets it, it comes to mean his identity as the leader of the values revaluation. So too, Zarathustra's identity as the teacher of the eternal recurrence is an interpretation of the bad inheritance from his father. I am deeply at odds with the recent commentary on Ecce Homo by Nicholas D. Moore, Nietzsche's Last Laugh, Ecce Homo, a satire, in which he claims that Nietzsche's identity in Ecce Homo and all of Nietzsche's works are satires. If Zarathustra's identity as the teacher of the eternal recurrence is Nietzsche's interpretation of a bad inheritance from his father, then he was not putting up that identity as a satire of philosophers who wish to be followed. The doctrine of the eternal recurrence, states Professor Moore, is a satire of the desire for escape from mortality. The will to power is a satire of the ideals of ethics, and the overhuman is a satire of the heroic ideal. Kathleen Higgins is of the same mind in treating large parts of Thus Spoke Zarathustra as a work of satire. While there is satire in these works, they are not essentially literary works. In The Prophet, Zarathustra has become one among those who have renounced life, but to him is granted a terrible dream. In it he sees all of humanity's past, encased in glass coffins, stretching out before him, on and on, back into the past as far as he can see. In the coffins lie life that has been overcome, and it stares back at him. He watches over these strange coffins on the mountain castle of death. There is a gate to the castle, but it has not been opened for a long time, and the gate is rusty, as is the key to it as well. Zarathustra has the key to the gate, and he opens it, but he is silent, and the gate closes again. Nothing is accomplished by opening the gate to stand speechless before the glass coffins. Zarathustra does not yet have the resources to break open the coffins. He is not yet the teacher of the eternal recurrence, with its lightning bolts of laughter. As his dream continues, a strong wind rushes up, and there is a knocking at the gate 3 times, and the wind blows the gate off its hinges, and a black coffin appears. Counterpointing the silence of the previous scene, from out of the black coffin rings 1,000 peals of laughter. Zarathustra is horrified by this climactic moment, and he awakens. He does not know the meaning of his dream, but the disciple who most loves his teaching interprets the dream for him, but tellingly, Zarathustra rejects the interpretation. The disciple says that the laughter is Zarathustra's laughter at the dismal scene of death in the stream, and that his teaching of life will triumph over humankind's long alienation from and entombment of its past, and prove that the soothsayer's prophecy of a nihilistic future is false. But Zarathustra just shakes his head at the disciple's interpretation. Why? It is true that the wind that blows the gates off its hinges, and the thousand peals of laughter that erupt from the black coffin refer to Zarathustra himself, but the disciple has skipped over the heart of the issue. One cannot just laugh at the sight of the history of human life overcome, entombed behind us in glass coffins, and make it otherwise. From what resource does the laughter come? Zarathustra's laughter is not a literary effect. Rather, it is the laughter of lightning bolts from out of the dark cloud of humanity, however that is to be realized. The mistake of the disciple in the prophet is to think that satire has the resources to bring us to our senses about what lies entombed in our past. But it is willing the eternal recurrence alone that makes this laughter of lightning bolts possible by freeing us from feelings and associated thoughts of renunciation. We master the dark cloud of our renunciation by willing the recurrence of the past. In the glass coffins of the entombed past, experiences stare back at us as experiences from which we are alienated, but which we must nevertheless integrate into ourselves. The laughter of willing the eternal recurrence will break open the coffins as laughter at the nonsense of the renouncing will now mastered. Then the will to power will set to work on the experiences they contain and integrate them into us. Let us for a moment set aside the question of what is making us beings of renunciation to begin with, and take in the immense sweep of Nietzsche's thinking in these two sections. There are three stages. First, there is a long history of our alienation from the past, and this has led to a culture of renunciation of life. Second, there is a present turning point made possible by Zarathustra's teaching of willing the eternal recurrence, suggesting that we have not known how to integrate the past up until now. Finally, there is a future overhuman to come who will compose in him or herself as a whole the fragment, riddle, and dreadful accident of the past. In the glass coffins lie life that has been overcome, but the overperson will be a being of invincible life, in which life that has been overcome in the past will be recovered, and future pasts to come will not be a threat. Nietzsche's model of evolution in these stages is Lamarckian. Today, Lamarckianism has become epigenetic theory. Epigenetics is the study of chemical regulation of DNA. Chemical bonding to the genes flag them up or down for replication. The chemical bond to the gene survives replication along with the gene. We are learning that experience can leave a heritable imprint on genetic code. I will reconstruct the three steps of these sections from Zarathustra as a set of possible hypotheses for three stages in our epigenetic evolution. That will come in a moment. Let us say, then, that these two texts, The Prophet and On Redemption, are a narrative of human epigenetic evolution. In summary, the imprint of the traumatic past is massing along one or more several common epigenetic pathways, and life in us is growing weaker as a result. The will to power has become pathologically preoccupied with the pastness of the past because it cannot will into that pastness and reach the traumatic weakening of life from the past and strengthen life against it. It is weakening itself by wanting the past to be different. In its weakness, the will to power has come to renounce itself, renounce life, and now vengefully seeks to hurt and cripple life. The traumatic past must become integrated into life by being engaged as resistance and mastered, so that life becomes more because of mastering it, not less by being overcome by it. That is what willing the eternal recurrence of the past will make possible. This is Nietzsche's idea of the wholeness of the overperson. In Nietzsche's account of our evolution, the turning point is that we can master our renunciation of life as caused by the weakening of the past by willing the recurrence of the past. In general, I can master feelings and associated thoughts of renunciation by mastering the feeling of wanting the renounced object to be different. Willing the recurrence of the past is a way to will that past not to be different, and so it loses its power to draw us into renunciation. Willing the eternal recurrence of the past is a cognitive exercise designed to ameliorate humankind's compulsive renunciation of life because of past weakening and the vengeful hatred of life associated with it. There are two radii out from the present moment, past and future. In one direction, the question is, how did we get this way, so weakened that our past is causing us to renounce all of life? What is in these coffins of the past? In the other direction, the question is, how does mastering the will's renunciation of life lead to an evolutionary successor of invincible life, an overhuman? Epigenetic research has shown that the imprint of past trauma is heritable. Drought, famine, disease, and war leave a heritable imprint as a change in epigenetic code. Memory of past trauma is heritable as well. Research into Alzheimer's disease has uncovered the role of epigenetic regulation in the encoding, consolidation, and retrieval of memory. We simply do not know how much ancestral trauma and ancestral memory we have. A modern reading of Nietzsche's New Lamarckianism in The Prophet is that we are inheritors of the epigenetic imprint of our whole ancestral traumatic past and of the memory of it. It is because we are carrying the imprint of trauma with us in our epigenetic code that we cannot shake off wanting a different past, that the will to power cannot stop its preoccupation with trying to strengthen us against that weakening. Humanity is in ruin, says Zarathustra in On Redemption, as if on a battlefield or a butcher's table because of the weakening we carry from the ancestral past. The traumas of the past have weakened the will to power in life in us and made it renouncing. That is the bottleneck. But what is the will to power to begin with? In his sketches for the Will to Power, which was not realized as a book, Nietzsche gave one of its subtitles as Attempt at a New Interpretation of Evolution. Nietzsche saw Darwinism's will to survival as self-preservation, and he thought that self-preservation happens only occasionally and as a limitation on the will to power in life, which is to grow and to become more. Life wills to add to itself, and life adds to itself when the will to power in it masters a resistance. A will to growth is the overwhelming state of the natural world for Nietzsche, not a will to self-preservation. Nietzsche's theory is sophisticated. The will to power in life seeks a resistance to master so that it can grow, and it can interpret what is an equal resistance to its strength of life at a given moment. Because the weakening of the past is in the past, the will to power cannot engage it and strengthen life against it. The will only wills forward. Because of this, the will to power has become hateful and renounced its own life-strengthening agency as futile. The will to power has turned against itself with a psychology of vengeful hatred of life. Nietzsche's great discovery was that by the cognitive exercise of willing the recurrence of the past, we undo this bottleneck and free the will to power to strengthen life in us against inherited weakening from the traumatic past. We do not know, and Nietzsche was not in a position to say whether or not there are other contravening psychologies set against the will to power. Nietzsche's diagnosis is that the traumatic past has weakened life in us and led to the rise of a decadence culture of vengeful renunciation of life. Building on Nietzsche's great diagnosis, I suggest also that the project of integrating our traumatic past is a source of fear for us, and that the fear of the free agency of will to power in integrating the traumatic past into ourselves has led to the rise of authoritarian culture. The integration of the past is terrifying. The will to power overthrows who we are and directs us to become something we know not what. Here too is the source of authoritarian domination. The freedom of the other so terrifies the authoritarian and drives him to dominate him or her because the will to power's integration of the traumatic past presupposes life in free play. The free play of life in the other opens onto the process of his or her integration of the traumatic past, and that process must start from the same points in us all. It must start with the same shared down-regulating epigenetic coding caused by our common inheritance of trauma, and proceed to engage that weakening, which is most painful. For the authoritarian, the free play of the agency of the will to power in the other recalls the integration of the weakening traumatic past as the direction the will to power is searching for in himself. And because he is terrified of that process replicating in himself, he fearfully dominates the free play of life in the other. We can formulate Nietzsche's ideas of the three stages of our evolution as a set of three hypotheses for epigenetics. First, is it possible that trauma from our ancestral past has been transferring from generation to generation, massing on and regulating the epigenetic code in the same direction to alter gene replication so that we are progressively becoming beings of less life? Second, willing the eternal recurrence is a cognitive exercise meant to enable us to master renunciation. It is similar to cognitive exercises currently being developed in clinical applications of epigenetics. Cognitive exercises that ameliorate affective disorders can cause a change in our epigenetic code. And any change in the epigenetic code, including those that we deliberately attempt to make to ourselves, is potentially heritable. So the second question is this: could willing the eternal recurrence be a cognitive exercise for all of humanity that ameliorates its renunciation psychology, resulting in a change to the epigenetic code that could undo the action of life overcome and lead to our becoming beings of überflüssige Leben, not just of life enough to preserve us? Third, is it possible that we could severally mask these changes so that they could come together along the same epigenetic pathway going forward, so as to bring forth a new being in our evolution? At this moment in time, however, we are at stage 1, and the will has turned against itself and become vengeful. The vengeful will expresses itself by trying to instate the renouncing will as the morally good will. The renouncing will seeks to instate the thought that equality is moral. The intended result is that life will remain hurt and crippled, for it is by the agency of will to power alone that strengthens life by mastering its intimate weaknesses. That, then, is the revenge of the crippled will, of the weakened will, that life remains hurt and crippled by not granting privilege rights to the will to power in its exercise of strengthening mastery over what weakens life. Nietzsche's analysis unmasks the morality of equality as a phantom of the weakened, vengeful will, frustrated by its lack of agency before the pastness of the traumatic past. And only the will to power stands against it. The will to power is not a literary construction in and by which we are to laugh and laugh away the morality of equality, as Professor Moore would have it. It is a true force of inequality. Overcoming the vengeful tyranny of moralizing equality is the key step from Enlightenment humanism to the overhuman, to the posthuman. Our present moment holds the potential to usher in our greatest moment. We are reaching out beyond being human to becoming the posthuman who extends into his or her many others, the other of bionics, robotics, genetically engineered replacement organs, and so on. In this posthuman world, what will be the unit against which equality is to be measured? It is unimaginable that everyone will have all of these things at the same time. Nietzsche wrote that we are sacrificing our future by our present philosophy of the morality of equality of wills. The advent of the posthuman squarely puts the question of the sacrifice of the future before us. What might be possible for an enhanced human type of unlimited lifespan and unlimited mental capacities as we develop internet-enabled bioimplants? Man is not the sacrosanct measure of things. Nietzsche's great diagnosis of our weakened life because of an inherited traumatic past shows that our renouncing culture, and maybe also our authoritarian cultures, West and East, create false ideas of selfhood with no purpose or value other than to psychologically protect us from integrating the traumatic past. Nietzsche calls on us to ask what height of life we can represent and set aside the self-preserving extravagance that not all can represent it. His vision of the overperson forecasts the posthuman. If there is to be progress, it will not be equal. Thank you.